Hello and welcome to the Broadcast Newswrap. Once again, it's your shorthand guide to the week's TV news stories, brought to you by the Broadcast editorial team. I'm senior reporter Max Goldbart, and this week I'm joined by Broadcast Intelligence lead analyst Jonathan Broughton and our Insights editor Jesse Whittock to discuss the impact of Rishi Sunak's summer budget on the TV sector. Rishi served us up a tasty meal, Mondays to Wednesdays, maximum saving £10. But are his plans to close the furlough scheme and get young people back into work wide of the mark when it comes to the unique nature of the TV industry? We've got all the latest analysis on the fallout impacting both broadcasters and producers, plus the ever-present and ever-popular What We've Been Watching on this week's Broadcast Newswrap. So we have Jonathan Broughton of Broadcast Intelligence, and it's great to welcome back Jesse Whittock, our Insight editor. Jonathan, how are you? It's been a little while.
I'm great. It's good to be back on what some are calling the world's greatest podcast.
And who would that be? Who's been calling us the world's greatest?
I mean, me just then. That's it.
It's got to start somewhere.
It's good to scoop that sort of accolade so early on in the pod. This week, we're going to be talking about the budget. Rishi Sunak unveiled a rare mini budget yesterday. Quite rare for it to be delivered over the summer, and the repercussions for the TV sector could be relatively large. So the budget was led by a job retention bonus, and this is a way to kind of stave off the worst impacts of the closure of the furlough scheme. So any company that has furloughed a member of staff will be given £1,000 when they welcome that staff member back onto their books. So we've got that. There's also a kickstart scheme for young workers. So 16 to 25-year-olds will have their jobs funded for 6 months as Rishi Sunak bids to kick the economy going again for young people, really. It's been shown across the board that young people are going to be disproportionately impacted by the economic ravages of COVID-19. And there were various other announcements related to sectors that are less related to broadcasting, and obviously we'll all be going for dinner from a Monday to a Wednesday as long as we stick to our £10 limit. So that's all very exciting. Jonathan, what did you make of the budget and its repercussions for the indie sector?
Yeah, I have to say that at first read, there's a lot of really impressive figures in there, but it left me a little bit uncertain around, whether it actually followed through enough to help media, especially. There were some terms in there that I was a little bit confused about where they applied and whether they were quite helpful. So I did some thinking, as I'm wont to do.
Oh no!
And I sort of divided. I finally worked out why I'm not sold on this as a plan, and I think it's because effectively a lot of the thinking behind certainly the loans part of the scheme seems to be designed from a big business mentality and not from an understanding of SMEs, the problems they face. And really specifically on this, I think it's because big businesses are dealing with cash flow and they can tank risk, whereas small businesses, although yes, they have cash flow issues, they simply can't deal with risk in the same way. And what I mean by that is a large business will be protecting shareholders, they'll be protecting profit margins, but if push comes to shove, they can go back in most cases to creditors, and our big broadcasters can do the same, and effectively ask for a bailout. They can tap into revolving credit facilities, which in layman's terms are secured loans from creditors. So very flexible and offer very, very good terms from people who want to support the business in general. SMEs, on the other hand, are effectively being given a small amount of cash, £2,000 to £50,000, which will tie them over for a couple of months at most, while they make cash payments on operational expenses that they need to keep the business going. It doesn't really cover salaries long term. It just about covers salaries in redundancy periods. So that's the kind of bailout that they've been given. So what in all, this asks of SMEs, of which, of course, we know media is so heavily reliant on, especially on the production side. It effectively asks them to guess at the state of our economy in roughly 6 months' time. The money's nice. It's certainly, it's not unhelpful, but it doesn't mitigate the uncertainty. I loved the idea of paying young people's wages, out to the future. I think that's a really, really good idea. And I certainly would have liked to seen something a bit more like that for SMEs especially. So businesses with less than 100 people, take away the uncertainty, perhaps tying loans or grants back to the profits of those businesses. So if they do effectively perform extremely well, the government can recoup that. So it's not a complete loss. It's just a short-term loan. But tying the loan to profits means, again, that uncertainty would have been mitigated. So fundamentally, my problem was big businesses can tank uncertainty. Our chancellor has come through hedge funds, Goldman Sachs, investment banks, understands big business very well. But I felt that there wasn't recognition that the choice that a lot of business leaders are making right now is, I either get this wrong and keep too many staff on and lose my entire business, or I get this wrong and fire too many staff and I take an extra year to recover. Most sensible business owners will take an extra year to recover. It's a responsible thing to do for their own staff. So I would have liked recognition of that. And I'm afraid I didn't really see that understanding flowing from the top.
Yeah, well, I think when you think about the TV sector, we did a sort of COVID-19 temperature take quite recently, a survey of 70 odd production companies. And it's quite damning and very worrying that many companies can't even afford to keep staff furloughed in August. And the only payment that a company needs to make in August towards that scheme is a national insurance payment. And in September, that moves to 10% and then doubles to 20%. And the fact that indies were already talking about layoffs and are worried about the position they're in, when all you have to do is fund a handful of staff's national insurance contribution is obviously quite worrying. And the TV sector, again, is quite unique, isn't it? And I think another reason why, unfortunately, this young employee kickstart scheme wouldn't work so well for the TV sector is that our staffing levels are so low and our freelancer levels are so high. I look at a lot of this stuff through the prism of freelancers because I've been doing so much work on it. Most small indies, or even some quite, medium-sized or larger, well-established indies, hire 5-6 people. Big drama indies have 5 or 6 employees on their books. So I can't see the TV sector hugely dipping into something like a young person's Kickstarter scheme when ultimately they might not be particularly encouraged to create those roles in the first place.
Well, I think even beyond that, Max, if you look at the makeup of a TV company, whether that be a small indie, whether that be a broadcaster or any sort of a large media organization, any media organization in general, there are very few 16 to 25-year-olds working within those businesses at all in any level, whether you're talking about receptionists, whether you're talking about APs, whether you're talking about, more senior executives. You don't tend to see 16 to 25-year-olds working in telly. It's a kind of, you could probably say it's a sort of late 20s plus industry, really. That you can go through training schemes and that we do, we at Broadcast, we have our Hot Shots initiative, which we run every year, where we try to shine the spotlight on younger people. And there are very few of those who are 22, 23, almost certainly no teenagers are put forwards for that, for example. And so, unfortunately, the help that the government have supplied through this 16 to 25 scheme, on the face of it, certainly my read is that it won't help television at all in those senses. And the worry there then is what happens to training schemes and people coming through the sort of 25, 26-year-olds. Like, do you hire someone who's relatively green but won't qualify for any support? Or do you go for someone who's, bit more experienced, might cost a bit more, but you know that your project's going to run smoother. So I don't think that's very helpful, unfortunately, for the TV sector. And I suppose for a lot of independent production companies, the furlough element of the mini budget is going to pose a lot of questions. Do you bring people back from furlough and get your £1,000 and try and kickstart your business that way, or do you, as many people have been talking about from various sectors and across the country, would it have been better just to extend the furlough scheme and allow people a little bit more breathing space? Because ultimately in October, if the TV industry isn't operating the way it needs to be, it's going to be a really dark time, right? Because there won't be any support, and it will be everyone for themselves, and that's not a great place for the business to be. But obviously at the moment, there's no clear indication of how things are going to shake out, bar it not looking great.
Yeah, I think with furlough, I expected that maybe TV companies would be using the scheme a little bit less than your average, just because of the aforementioned low staffing levels. But again, our survey showed that around 2/3 were taking advantage of it in some respect. I think some of that will have changed a little bit, like the soaps, for example. The big super indies that run the soaps did quite a lot of furloughing, and now the soaps are back into production. So presumably that's changed a little bit. But yeah, I think August and September, the crunch time is arriving potentially for a lot of these smaller businesses.
And I think a lot of indies are talking about or certainly really concerned about the potential for a second spike. And that's obviously not something that is contained within the TV industry. But a second spike and a second production lockdown would be disastrous for a lot of companies. I mean, there's people we're speaking to at the moment are talking about sort of tentatively getting crews back and working out ways to make their shows and going back into precincts like hospitals and prisons and those sorts of places where the distancing is more difficult than in other ways. If there is a second spike in September, October, that's going to completely shut that down, and then even big sort of relatively well-equipped independent production companies have significant cash flow problems coming their way.
Yeah. I mean, I can't possibly predict if there's a second spike as bad as the one that we've just had. I don't know if the furlough scheme just naturally gets extended until the end of the year and everything just gets put off a little bit further. But you certainly worry that many companies just wouldn't. The overheads associated with simply running a small company wouldn't be able to continue stretching regardless of the existence of furlough. Jonathan, was there anything else that you thought the government could have enacted that might have made a real difference in the broadcasting sector?
Yeah, so going back to your furlough point, I think one of the key things in that is exactly what you've been highlighting. Is again, and I keep banging on about this. It's the uncertainty. There could be a second wave. There might not be a second wave. But right now, what we're asking businesses to do is put their future on the line to help a more general UK economy, and taking a personal risk on to help society is surely something our government should be helping out with. So again, I know I've mentioned this before, but these schemes should be much clearer. They should be given with much more warning. I'd like to see, right now, government guidance about a second wave, because, like we say, we know that production is so, debt laden, and it's a burden on the production companies themselves to find creditors and funding for the programs they're making. If they get stuck into this and suddenly a second wave appears, they will frankly, will lose half the industry, and that's I don't think that's being over egging it. So I'd like to see the government step in and create. There are schemes which are similar to this. So there's the EU funds for companies which are doing business under duress, who are directly trying to fund themselves with the idea that a second wave or further consequences could come out. It costs money to make money. So naturally, I think our government should step in and again take some of that risk, bankroll it for the sake of the nation's economy.
What about the broadcasters, Jonathan? I thought we might take this opportunity to just quickly examine the state of play. BBC, ITV, and C4 maybe. I mean, we talked a little bit a few weeks ago about plummeting ad revenues and the difficulties that's particularly Channel 4 was finding itself in. Are we seeing a little bit of a comeback from the broadcasters? What's the state of play?
Yeah, we did chat a little bit about it. I guess this is a time to highlight the sunny lining of media, in which that, throughout this entire process, the effective source of all income in media, the consumer consuming, is higher than ever. So media is not being affected in the same way that, say, retail is. The demand is absolutely there. And the only problems facing it are, the fact that advertising is linked to general economic conditions rather than media specific. So we're losing money because of sort of general economic downturns. What that means is, as soon as demand for other sectors starts increasing, then of course advertising will return. So although there are a whole range of schemes, you mentioned £10 for eating out, that will in fact have an effect on advertising for media, of course, as various companies start bidding for attention on that. I would also recommend anyone who is listening to this podcast, TV advertising has never been cheaper and has never been so accessible by so many people. So frankly, if you're thinking about taking a dip into advertising right now, it is perhaps the best return on investment, if suitable for your product, of course, that it has ever been and ever will be so. So I am on commission for that, of course. But that's also true. So effectively what I'm saying is that at the top line of our giant pyramid of cash flowing into the media value chain, most of it's intact. Pay TV is still working. D2C, of course, is through the roof, and advertising is recovering. I've done some modeling around this. Roughly by the end of the year, by December, on a month-by-month basis, I'm expecting to see advertising, so the money flowing to the broadcasters, returning to sort of 90% of what it was the year before. I think the entirety of 2021 will be probably about 10% down. So nothing that they can't tank effectively. This leaves them with a couple of options. They can either take costs on themselves, effectively spending the same amount as they did the year before in order to preserve viewership, especially where it comes to competing with players who are not faced with downturns in advertising, or they can cut costs and choose to preserve the value of that company. Now, if we take Channel 4 as an example, if they were to spend as they did in 2019 next year, they would roughly, over 2020 and 21, end up losing around £100 million for the 2-year period. It sounds like a lot of money. It's not. Channel 4 has instant cash reserves of something like 150 million. So the good news is that, yes, if you're a producer and you're having conversations where the broadcasters are perhaps reticent to start producing, it's not because they can't afford it, and they probably will be going back to spending to 2019 levels as soon as there's some sort of feeling of guarantee around ability to actually complete on programming. So there doesn't seem to be a permanent long-term damage to the media industry yet. The advertising downturn is transient, and I would expect most of it to have sort of evaporated. It will be returning to something more like normal by the end of the year. So perhaps Christmas will see a bit of a bonanza of cash flowing back into broadcasters and some more familiar deep pockets starting to spend as they were previously.
Some positive news, Jonathan.
I thought
cash
so.
bonanzas. It's been a while since anybody has uttered two such words. Jesse, things are feeling a little bit more back to normal, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. One thing we've noticed recently, we track a lot of the program announcements and commissions, and certainly there seem to be more of them than there were 2 months ago, which might be obvious on the face of it, but equally it's good to see that the kind of commissioning appetites seem to be returning. There seems to be more volume orders, which is obviously a really good thing in terms of company cash flow. So yeah, there are signs that things are getting back to what they need to be. It'll be interesting to see how some of these kind of bigger productions that that deliver ratings towards the end of the year, which tend to go into production around now, what happens with them. So we're talking about the X Factor and Voice and things like that, how those shows are produced and whether they can sort of hold up the 6, 7, 8, 9 million that they will do week in, week out on a Saturday. But yeah, all in all, in a quite a grim period for telly, it's starting to feel like something like normality.
Moving on to some people's favourite segment, clearly. It's what we've been watching. Jonathan, you've been binging Netflix once again.
I have. I've been delving into the past, and I have been catching up on seasons 1 and 2 of The Sinner. I think one of the most interesting things about it is clearly Bill Pullman is being paid by the word, and as season 2 has progressed, he is averaging less than 30 words per episode, which is fascinating. But no, it's really interesting to see the development of the character in that. It's a man who is at the top of his game as a detective, but in terms of the how he copes with the rest of his life, completely inadequate, and it's something really, really enjoyable. There's some nice story arc going on, a little bit of carryover from the first series, some nice twists, some psychopathic hippies, which was surprising to say the least. But yeah, thoroughly well written, well acted show, and nice to see Bill Pullman back and doing some stuff on the small screen.
Excellent. Psychopathic hippies sounds like
another 2 words you don't necessarily hear together.
If you were to get a cash bonanza from a psychopathic hippie, then you're hitting the jackpot. I've also been on Netflix. We do watch the PSBs sometimes. I've been watching Trial by Media, which is a really interesting documentary series looking at big US trials that were heavily impacted by the journalism around them. And the first episode is called Talk Show Murder, and it got me thinking a lot about duty of care stuff. It's a story that I'd never heard of before, but covered in really, really close detail. There was a guy called Jonathan Schmitz went on to the Jenny Jones show I think this was like the early 90s. And he went on to a segment whereby somebody else would reveal their secret crush. And a guy revealed his secret crush on this guy, Jonathan Schmitz. They were childhood friends. And 4 days later, Jonathan Schmitz killed him.
Wow.
And then it ended up, so Warner Media ended up being taken to civil court for duty of care dereliction, basically, and allowing this person to be humiliated on national television, which in turn turned him to killing his friend. But it's a super interesting documentary, and was a story that I wasn't familiar with.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard of that either. I think I'll definitely give that a go. Yeah.
No, give it a watch. Up the Netflix. Jesse, well, how about yourself?
So I've mainly been so I downloaded the Now TV package, which they were offering basically so you could get all of the sport, particularly the football, for a month on a reduced fee, which is a really smart thing to do. And my wife, at first, she was quite pleased to see some live sport in the house. That lasted for a couple of days, and now the sight of a green pitch is causing friction in the house. So I'm trying to sort of ration the amount of football I'm watching. I've actually had the England cricket return playing in the background as I've been working today. I'm glad I haven't really been focusing on it because England have been absolutely terrible. So sport's been sort of my order of the day, along with just rewatching some old episodes of Rick and Morty, who's, I'm sure, don't need any introduction. Great show on Netflix, but was originally from one of the US cable networks. That's been me.
Nice. Some quality lockdown viewing all round. Well, it's been great to have the two of you on the pod, sharing thoughts on a budget, and we will be back soon. Thank you for listening to the Broadcast Newswrap. I'm Senior Reporter Max Goldbart, and you've been listening to Broadcast Intelligence Lead Analyst Jonathan Broughton and Insight Editor Jesse Whittock, while the pod's editor was John Elms. You can check out past episodes of the pod on Spotify and iTunes, or on the website via www.broadcastnow.co.uk.